Welcome once more to the history of ancient Rome. We are continuing in our examination of early Roman history, and we're going to move away today from the regal period, which has occupied our attention for the previous two lectures, and look at the foundation of the Republic. The Roman Republic, established by tradition in 509 BC, which continued as a form of government down to 31 BC. So a long period of existence by the Roman Republic. A very interesting and dynamic period of history. It'll be the framework for our lectures for quite a while yet. It's in this period that the Romans gained control over Italy. It's in this period that they gained control over the rest of the Mediterranean. And then towards the end of the Republic, we find a fascinating process of dissolution. It's awesome to watch this happen, the unraveling of so carefully a constructed system of government on the rocks of political ambition and a lack of consensus. But all of that is the subject for future lectures. What I want to do today is focus specifically on the foundation of the Republic, the transition from monarchy to republic. And first of all, we will look at the Roman traditions. As always, I believe they are the starting point, and we should always take them into account first and foremost. We look at the Roman traditions concerning the fall of the monarchy, the expulsion of the Tarquins from Rome in 509 BC. We'll see that, unsurprisingly, these turn out to be rather moralistic tales. They're very colourful, but nonetheless, the issue of their historicity will be discussed as well. And we'll see as well how, in the Roman tradition, the early Republic faced some immediate challenges, which it overcame by having in its midst all kinds of wonderful characters who had the right moral fibre to stand up against these challenges, meet them, and bring the Republic into a new dawn. We will also look at the shape of the early Republic in its broadest outlines. These, of course, again remain matters of tremendous uncertainty given our source material. But the broad outlines have been generally agreed upon by most scholars, at least the outlines of the system of government. And we'll end with a discussion of the emergence, possible emergence at this time of the order of the plebs, of the plebeians, and set the stage thereby for a discussion of the struggle of the orders in the next lecture. In Roman tradition, the expulsion of the Tarquins, the end of monarchic government at Rome, was a very personal event. It centred around a single crime, which, if we believe the sources, so incensed the Roman aristocracy that they figured that they'd had enough not only of Tarquin, but of the whole institution of kingship, which had gone sour. The crime was committed on a woman of noble birth, Lucretia, the wife of a nobleman, Collatinus, who, with his young Turk friends, was out besieging a neighbouring city of the Romans one time. And at a drinking party with his friends, the issue arose as to the relative merits of their wives, as can happen at all male drinking parties. And various men began to boast about the qualities of their wives, and Collatinus especially praised the virtue of his wife Lucretia. They decided that the best way to see if this was true was to test it. So drunk though they were, they got on their horses. I presume there was no regulations against drunk riding in those days. And they galloped back to Rome and visited each of the houses in turn, and of course found many of the wives involved in parties, which is what wives are not supposed to do when their husbands are besieging neighbouring towns. But when they went into Lucretia's house, there she was, spinning wool with her maids. One of the members of this party was none other than Sextus Tarquinius, the son of Tarquin the Arrogant. And we're told Sextus Tarquinius was overcome with an unnatural lust for the virtuous Lucretia. So at some later date, when Collatinus was away, Sextus comes back to the house of Lucretia, is invited in, invited to stay the night, and in the midst of the night enters her bedroom, threatens her with a sword, and rapes her. He says that if she says anything, he will murder a slave and let it be known that she was raped by a slave, which he found, this act in progress, which he found and then kill the slave. He would present himself as a hero who would save Lucretia, but she would be forever humiliated for having been raped by a slave, herself and her family. When her father and husband came back, Lucretia, unable to hide this dreadful act, broke down in tears and revealed what had happened. And she was inconsolable, and try though they might, her menfolk could not make her see the fact that she was a victim, and to preserve her honour and the honour of her family, she committed suicide. One member of the group who found Lucretia, a friend of the family's, was named Lucius Junius Brutus, a man of the nobility, who was so incensed by this act, this final crime on the part of the Tarquin dynasty, that he helped rouse opinion against the Tarquins among the aristocracy, and they were thrown out of Rome. They were expelled. They weren't killed, but they were driven away. And the Republic was declared, with Brutus and Collatinus as the first annual magistrates of the Republic. That is the tale as we have it in our sources. It's a tale of personal transgression with political consequences. But the saga isn't over then. Tarquinius is out of Rome, but he's still alive. The first threat to the Republic is a plot from inside Rome to restore the monarchy. The plot's discovered, and the leaders of the plot executed. Tarquin himself, however, is outside Rome marshalling support among his friends in Tuscany, among the Etruscans originally, and he makes 2 attempts with Etruscan backing to retake the city by violence, and both attempts are defeated. The second attempt is the most threatening and is led by the king of the Etruscan town Clusium, a man with the glorious name Lars Porsena. He's an ally of Tarquin, and this attempt, we're told, came very close to success, but ultimately failed. Tarquin, however, wasn't finished. He made one last attempt to rouse Rome's Latin subjects, or allies, against her, and attempted to seize control of Rome through rebellion among the Latins, but that finally failed at 499 BC at a crucial battle of Lake Regillus, and as a result, Tarquin gave up, retired to the Campanian town of Cumae, where he died in exile. So the story then is the expulsion of the Tarquins for reasons of, as I say, reasons of personal crime, but then attempted retakings of the city. It's all very dramatic, all very heroic. And all throughout, the story's laced with wonderful romantic tales. I'll take just one example, which certainly when I was a schoolboy, way back in the BC years, was required learning in English. English class. These were the Lays of Ancient Rome by Lord Macaulay, published in 1842, apparently no longer in print in and of themselves, which is a shame because they are tremendous poems. But there was always an image that has stuck in my head ever since, and is in fact derived from the tales of early Rome as written by Livy. That's the story of Horatius on the bridge. The story goes that in Tarquin's second attempt to take Rome with the backing of Lars Porsena, the Etruscan horde came over the hill and frightened the Roman force that was across the Tiber waiting for them to approach. And the force broke up in panic. The leader of that force, a man called Horatius Cocles, organised his men, rallied them, and said, "You go at the bridge." It was a wooden bridge. Remember the bridge built by Ancus Marcius, a wooden bridge over the Tiber. "You break up the bridge, and I'll take care of the Etruscans." Yes, he single-handedly holds off the Etruscan army, while his men behind hack at the bridge with their axes. Not only that, but he taunts the Etruscans as he's fighting them single-handedly away from the bridge. He mocks them and says they are merely the slaves of a tyrant who, with no liberty of their own, have come to rob others of their liberty. Mockingly hacking them down left and right. Livy has a wonderful expression in a surge of blood to the head. Livy, in a patriotic burst, describes Horatius as that great soldier whom the fortune of Rome gave to be her shield on that day of peril. Oh, it's rousing stuff. You want to go out and beat up some Etruscans. Well, the bridge finally collapses behind Horatius, and he's left stranded, facing his enemies. So what does he do? Jumps into the Tiber River fully armed and swims across, where he's met with tremendous hullabaloo. Multiple honours are conferred upon him and a public statue erected in his honour. So, what do we have? Well, we have more moral tales, don't we? We have tales of moral fibre. After all, Livy, in his introduction to his history, states unequivocally that the function of his description of Roman history is to present exempla, models of behaviour, good and bad. It's at least one of his functions. His other main function is to trumpet the Roman achievement and the gloriousness of the Roman nation. And he states that quite clearly at the beginning of Book 1, in his preface to his history. Here's why I'm doing this. I want to present examples. And in the cycle of tales around the expulsion of the Tarquins, there are wonderful examples, both good and bad. We have Lucretia, the paradigm of womanly virtue. She's so concerned about her own honour and the honour of her family, and by her family I mean her family's menfolk and their name, that she commits suicide rather than face the disgrace of being accused of being raped by a slave, or even have been raped at all, even if they could prove Tarquin to have been the perpetrator. We have the martial model of Horatius Cocles, patriot, gallant warrior, who single-handedly holds off in the Etruscan army, risks his own life to save the state. That's a great model of martial prowess. We have in the first consul, Lucius Junius Brutus, the man considered generally to have been the founder of the Republic, since he organized the coup d'etat that ousted the Tarquins. We have in him another rather more difficult model for us in the modern world to understand, but a model of what the Romans considered a most admirable quality, the quality of severitas, the quality of sticking by your principles, regardless of how hard it might be. And this centres on what I mentioned earlier, the attempted restoration of the monarchy from within Rome. Because what I didn't say was that the leaders of that attempted restoration were the sons of Brutus. And Brutus, as the magistrate, had to preside over the execution of his own sons, which he did. Now, we might find that somewhat disturbing, but for the Romans, this is a model of severitas, standing firm beside your principles, which are the principles now of liberty and freedom in the face of monarchic oppression, even if it means executing your own children. Moral tales. What do we do with these moral tales? Modern scholars have come up with various explanations. For those who believe in the wider Etruscan political control of of central Italy, then naturally enough, the expulsion of the Tarquins fits into the waning power of the Etruscans in central Italy. Enough of that, I don't need to go into that anymore. There are others who take a rather more extreme view. They simply dismiss completely the legends and tales, moral tales surrounding the expulsion of the kings and say, no, what we have going on is not a single catastrophic revolutionary event, like the expulsion of the Tarquins, but rather a process of evolution. In other words, what we have is a gradual process of the devolution of the king's power to annual magistrates. And eventually the king is sort of phased out of the picture. This process going on for maybe 70 or 80 years. Some of them argue even that it goes right down to 450 BC. Okay, so it's a long process of evolution that's basically been ignored completely by the Roman sources and presented instead as this single event surrounded by all these wonderful romantic tales. That view doesn't carry much weight among the majority of scholars. It's considered to be too extreme. Another view is to see in the story of Lucretia events that are not, in fact, entirely improbable. This approach would say that within royal dynasties, personal acts can actually have tremendous political consequences. it's not unlikely that the transgression of that nature by a prince against a noblewoman's wife might have severe political ramifications for the dynasty as a whole. They would point to other well-documented dynasties. For those of you, perhaps, who have seen or heard Professor Jeremy McInerney's course on ancient Greece, you may be familiar with the stories of the expulsion of the tyrants from Greece. The tyrant Hippias is driven out of Athens, He's driven out of Athens over a lover's quarrel between himself and his brother and 3 other men. So here's an event that has a personal quality, but has severe political ramifications for the tyranny at Athens. So similarly goes the argument, it's quite possible that something like this actually took place and that it was a personal event that led to the Tarquins' expulsion. The view that I find the most intriguing is one that peeks through now and then from the ancient sources, an alternative tradition about the end of the monarchy. That tradition, which is mentioned in a few Roman sources, records that Lars Porsena, the Etruscan king of Clusium, captured Rome. He actually took it, and then, presumably, he abolished the monarchy and established the republic. Why he did so, or so on, that's not clear. All we get are vague hints that this took place. In the end, it has to be said that the evidence we have is just isn't sufficiently clear for us to make a definite determination among these competing possibilities. But once again, we have competing possibilities. Whatever the case, when the Tarquins were expelled, the fledgling republic began to adopt its distinctive shape, and it's perhaps worth looking at that. As we'll see, the Republic, the Roman Republic, during its long period of existence, went through a very protracted process of evolution in terms of its polity, in terms of the shape of its government. And naturally enough, the very earliest phases of it are somewhat unclear, but the broad outline seems to be generally agreed upon by most scholars in the field. Essentially, the kings are replaced by 2 annually elected magistrates who are called consuls or possibly praetors, which the latter phrase, praetor, seems to be a form of magistracy that's found within Etruscan cities. It may be that the Romans adopted that term first to indicate these 2 annually elected magistrates. In other words, you have two men, as I mentioned at the start. The first 2 are Junius Brutus and Collatinus. These 2 men are the first consuls, and then every year there are new elections and they're replaced. I'm going to call them consuls for the sake of clarity. I don't want to keep saying consuls or praetors, but just to let you know, one example of the uncertainty surrounding this earlier period is that we're not even really clear what these guys were called at the start, either consuls or praetors. What's noteworthy straight away about this system of government is that 2 basic principles that were to forever mark office holding in Republican Rome are established at the very outset. You have a limited tenure of office of 1 year's duration, and you always have at least one other colleague, one other person with the same powers as yourself holding that office. So collegiality, having at least one colleague, and only holding the office for a limited period of time, limited tenure of office, these 2 principles, if we believe our sources, were established right at the start. There's no reason to disbelieve it. Again, comparative data from Greece would suggest that this is quite common. Kings being replaced by annual magistrates, quite common. How do we know who the consuls were? Well, the Romans kept a list of them. They're called fasti, and they're a matter of considerable debate and uncertainty. The fasti are lists year by year of who the consuls were, and they seem to have gone back to their right back to the very start, back to 509 BC. There are 2 views on the believability of the fasti: the skeptical view and the more trusting view. The skeptical view is that the fasti have suffered, especially the earliest years of it, prior to about 280 BC, have suffered from interpolation from later periods. Skeptics point out that you have families who are in better documented times prominent among the list of consuls, have nothing going back for centuries, and then suddenly one of them appears in the very earliest lists. They say this is clearly a case of later families sticking their names into the past to get themselves better historical credentials. The more trusting people take the diametrically opposite view from the same evidence. This is what's so fascinating about this, I find, and so typical of ancient history. The diametrically opposite view. They point to the opposite case and say, hang on, you have consuls in the early lists with names that never appear again. Why invent people who are nobodies? Surely the names must reflect historical reality. You decide. Whatever the case, later Romans had a list of consuls, so they could tell year by year who the consuls were, and it went all the way back to 509 BC, right back to the supposed start of the Republic. In addition to the consuls then, we have already seen that there was the Comitia Curiata from the regal period, and possibly stretching back to the regal period, the other assembly of the people, the Comitia Centuriata, the assembly of people organised into centuries. And these two popular assemblies remained and became, in fact, cornerstones of the new republic. For it was the Comitia Centuriata, the centuriate assembly, the military assembly, if you want to think of it that way, that elected the consuls every year. And the Comitia Curiata are the ones who conferred imperium on the consuls, as they had done on the kings. So, if you want to think of it this way, on one day, the citizens would assemble in their centuries to hold elections for the consuls. Once the two consuls had been elected, on some other subsequent day, the same people would assemble again, but this time in their curiae, to confer and ratify the choice and confer imperium on the consuls. Remember, imperium always comes from the Roman people. That's another key concept of the Roman Republic. The consuls then basically replaced the king. They took over the main judicial and military functions of the king. But the Romans were a highly practical people. They said sometimes in emergencies, it's not going to be possible to have two commanders with equal power. You might have a gridlock situation at a crucial moment when a firm hand is needed. So they allowed for a temporary monarchy, if you like. They worked into the early republic a system that allowed for, in extreme circumstances, the appointment of a man called a dictator, a man who spoke and people listened. That's the idea behind it. And he was an extraordinary magistrate. He was chosen from among the members of the Senate. Precisely how this early period is unclear. In later years, he was nominated from among the ex-consuls. And he did not have a colleague. And his job was to sort out the particular problem that he'd been appointed to sort out. So he was only chosen in extraordinary circumstances and given the job, fixed that. That was his job. He appointed, below him, the dictator appointed an assistant called the Master of Horse, the Magister Equitum, the Master of the Cavalry, which suggests that the original function of this office was definitely military. It was to sort out or at least obviate the possibility that two consuls who didn't like each other or who disagreed about how the war should continue would gridlock the Roman effort in that war and appoint a definite general to carry out a specific task. So once again, the dictatorship is to carry out a specific task and is appointed only in extraordinary circumstances. In addition to the dictator, the king's religious duties devolved onto the nobility, and specifically the old pre-existing college of the pontiffs, the pontifices, who were probably around from the regal period. And the chief of the pontifical college, the Pontifex Maximus, now rose up as the chief priest of Rome. He basically took over much of the king's duties in the religious sphere. And so he became the chief priest. And forever afterwards, the Pontifex Maximus was the chief priest of Rome. He's the one chiefly responsible for maintaining the good relationship with the gods. We will look at, in the later lecture, at the system of Roman paganism, its belief system, and the way that it was administered by the various officials who ran it. But suffice it to say right now that the priestly colleges were not made up of any separate entity or any separate class from the politicians. It's the nobility who provide Rome with its politicians, its generals, and its priests. They're all the same people. One can be a priest and a general and a consul all at the same time. Okay, so that's an important point as well to appreciate early on. The king himself is generally agreed to have survived in vestigial form in the position of the Rex Sacrorum, the king of the sacred rites. Why this should be so was unclear. Various arguments have been put forward. The relationship between the Pontifex Maximus and the king of the sacred rites has been discussed. I won't go into all those details. It's a very, very fine and detailed argument that we don't have to delve into. But suffice it to say that I think the majority view is safely that the Rex Sacrorum, this king of the sacred rites, is a vestige of the old king. Depoliticized, because rather interestingly, unlike all the other priests, the Rex Sacrorum is not allowed to be a member of the Senate. His duties are specifically religious, and he's essentially excluded from the political life of the state, which would, I think, support the view that the Rex Sacrorum is in fact the sort of stripped-down king, the king divested of his political power, but still responsible for various religious duties. Such then is, broadly speaking, the roughly agreed upon shape of the early republic, he says, qualifying himself at every turn. So many of these issues are a matter of debate and uncertainty. I'm presenting you with what I believe to be the majority view in most of these cases. We have seen in the previous lecture on regal society the appearance of the order called the patriciate, or the patrician order, the Latin word ordo, once again referring to a rank, a social status, social rank. And it seems that in the early republic we have the appearance for the first time of the other order that was to become dominant in the early republic and influence the shaping of the early republic and politics of this period, and that is the plebeian order. In our ancient sources, the plebeians are presented as always being there. They were there alongside the patricians, and they were constituted of everybody else. All the people, at least all the freeborn citizen body who were not patricians, were classified as plebeians. It seems odd, however, it has struck certain scholars as extremely curious that they should be described as an order. Why not just call them everyone else? Because the order really implies some sort of organization, some kind of a limitation on membership. And so it seems to be the case, at least it's been argued forcefully, that the plebeians are in fact a rather more restricted, originally rather more restricted body of citizens who grow up in opposition to, perhaps as a foil to the patricians at some early stage, and they seem to have their own socio-political agenda. Precisely who these plebeians were, we just can't say. We just don't have the evidence available to us, especially since the Romans believed that the plebeians were always there. It confuses the matter all the more. But a good case can be made that the plebeians arose in the early republic not quite in opposition to, but parallel to the patrician class, with their own socio-political agenda. Whether or not there were rich and influential families originally in the plebeian order is a matter of some discussion. The case seems to be that the richer, non-patrician, richer families of Rome joined the plebeian order later. Because, as we'll see in the next lecture, in the course of a major formative event in the early republic, what the Romans called the struggle of the orders, the plebeians began agitating for certain privileges, certain rights, reforms and changes in the way the state was run. And our evidence would suggest that initially those first motives for agitation were of a socio-economic nature, which would apply to the lesser well-off people, in Roman society, and so the argument goes the plebeians were originally the less influential non-patrician families, who in the course of the struggle of the orders joined forces with richer non-patrician families to form the final plebeian order of the later era. But that's a story which we should postpone to the next lecture.